The last letter arrived after the funeral chapter. One, the church bells of St. Aldwyn rang 11 measured notes across the valley, their familiar sound rolling over cottages with ivy-covered walls, neatly clipped hedges, and gardens still glowing with the last roses of early autumn. In most villages, funerals were occasions of solemn reflection. In St. Aldwyn, they were also occasions when every old friendship, every forgotten disagreement, and every carefully hidden family secret quietly resurfaced beneath respectful conversation. The funeral of Eleanor Ashcombe drew nearly the entire village to St. Matthew's Church. Few people could remember a time when Miss Ashcombe had not been part of village life. For more than half a century, she had chaired charity committees, organized harvest festivals, restored the church library, and quietly paid school fees for children whose parents would never know where the money had come from. She had become less a person than an institution. Now that institution was gone, the oak coffin rested before the altar beneath arrangements of white lilies and pale roses, while sunlight streamed through stained glass and settled across the polished wood. The Reverend Thomas Elwood spoke gently. We remember not merely the years of life, but the kindness that filled them. Several heads bowed. Several eyes remained dry. Others watched one another instead of the coffin. Near the rear pew sat Mrs. Jane Marlowe, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighboring village for many years. Though quiet by nature, she possessed the rare habit of noticing small inconsistencies that others dismissed. She had accepted Eleanor's invitation to countless afternoon teas over the decades, and while they had never called themselves close friends, mutual respect had grown naturally between them. She listened less to the sermon than to the breathing of those around her. Grief had its own rhythm. So did anxiety. A man 3 pews ahead tapped one finger steadily against the polished wood. Someone behind her sighed each time the vicar mentioned generosity. Across the aisle, a young woman twisted a handkerchief until her knuckles turned white. Small things, almost invisible, yet people often betrayed themselves through habits rather than words. When the final hymn ended, the congregation slowly followed the coffin into the churchyard. Autumn leaves drifted lazily across ancient gravestones. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Villagers gathered in little circles almost immediately. I heard she passed peacefully. They say her heart simply failed. I thought it was pneumonia. No. Old age finally caught her. Each speaker sounded entirely certain. None possessed genuine knowledge. Mrs. Marlowe accepted a cup of tea offered by one of the church volunteers and quietly wandered toward the edge of the churchyard, where conversation became easier to overhear without appearing to listen. Near the yew hedge stood Richard Ashcombe. Tall, neatly dressed, and recently arrived from London, he was Eleanor's only surviving nephew. He accepted condolences with polished ease. "She always spoke proudly of you," an elderly gentleman remarked. Richard smiled. She was very kind. The smile appeared exactly when required. It disappeared exactly when the speaker turned away. Mrs. Marlowe noticed. Nearby stood Clara Finch, only 27. Clara had spent the past 3 years living at Ashcombe House as Eleanor's companion. She looked genuinely exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. And although she thanked every visitor sincerely, grief seemed to weigh upon her more heavily than simple employment could explain. Several women embraced her warmly. Others merely observed. Companions occupied uncertain places in village society. They were trusted enough to know everything, accepted enough to know everyone, yet they never quite belonged. Colonel Bernard Haversham adjusted his walking stick. "Remarkable woman." His companion nodded. "Remarkable memory." Indeed, the colonel hesitated. I imagine she remembered rather more than was convenient. The conversation stopped there. Neither man elaborated. Neither needed to. In villages like Street Aldwyn, unfinished sentences often carried more meaning than complete ones. Ashcombe House overlooked the village green from behind iron gates and rows of ancient chestnut trees. The reception after the funeral followed Eleanor's written wishes precisely. There, sandwiches, seed cake, lemon sponge, nothing extravagant, nothing careless. Guests drifted through elegant drawing rooms lined with books collected over decades. Portraits of long-dead Ashcombe watched silently from the walls. Every clock ticked with almost military precision. Everything remained exactly where Eleanor had always insisted it belonged. Almost. Mrs. Marlowe wandered into the library. The shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound volumes stood in immaculate order. Only one small space remained empty. A single book had recently been removed. The lighter patch upon the wood was unmistakable. She reached toward it, not to replace anything, simply to observe. Dust had settled evenly across every nearby shelf. Except there, someone had removed a book very recently. Curious. She smiled faintly. Books rarely disappeared by accident. Footsteps approached. She turned. Philip Grayson, Eleanor's solicitor, entered carrying a leather document case. He looked tired, not merely from arranging a funeral. His expression suggested someone balancing several unpleasant responsibilities simultaneously. "You've escaped the crowd," he observed politely. "For a moment. So have you." He laughed softly. "One does what one can." Before either could continue, a maid appeared. "Mr. Grayson, everyone is ready." He nodded. "I suppose they are." The guests gathered in the drawing room. Conversations gradually faded. Mr. Grayson unfolded several neatly prepared documents. As many of you know, Miss Ashcombe requested that portions of her will be read privately today before formal probate proceedings. Every eye settled upon him. He adjusted his spectacles. Specific charitable donations will be distributed to St. Matthew's Church, the village library, the district hospital, and several educational trusts. No one seemed surprised. Then he continued, "Ashcombe House and the surrounding estate shall pass jointly to my nephew Richard Ashcombe and my companion Clara Finch, provided they reach mutual agreement concerning its future." Silence. Absolute silence. Richard blinked. Clara stared at the solicitor as though convinced she had misheard him. Across the room, someone quietly dropped a teaspoon onto a saucer. "Mrs. Marlowe observed both principal beneficiaries carefully. Richard recovered first. His smile returned. Too quickly. Clara did not smile at all. She looked almost frightened. Interesting. Very interesting. The reading concluded without further surprises. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations resumed in hushed voices. Speculations spread faster than the tea. Joint ownership invited disagreement. Disagreement invited motive. Mrs. Marlowe drifted toward the French doors opening onto the garden. The late afternoon sun had slipped behind gathering clouds. A cool wind stirred the roses. Behind a hedge, voices carried unexpectedly clearly. "You've no idea what this means," Richard said sharply. "It was her decision," Clara answered. "You persuaded her. I never asked for anything. Convenient. I looked after her because someone needed to." There followed a long silence. When Richard finally spoke again, his voice had become calmer. "Things needn't become unpleasant. They already have." Footsteps approached. Mrs. Marlowe quietly examined a nearby rose bush with great interest. Neither noticed her presence as they walked toward separate paths in the garden. She remained where she was for several moments. People often believed anger revealed itself through shouting. In truth, it more often revealed itself through restraint. And Richard Ashcombe had exercised remarkable restraint. Inside the house, the grandfather clock struck 5. Moments later, the front bell rang. The village postman stood upon the doorstep, holding a single cream-colored envelope. Its address was written in elegant blue ink. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, posted only 3 days before. Too late to reach the woman for whom it had been intended. Clara accepted it slowly. Before anyone could decide whether the letter should be opened, the sound of screeching tires echoed from the gravel drive. A police motor car came to an abrupt stop. A uniformed constable stepped out. His face was pale. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "there's been a serious incident involving Dr. Harold Bennett." Chapter 2, Shadows Before Dusk. For several long seconds after the constable spoke, no one moved. The drawing room, so recently filled with the comforting sounds of teacups and quiet conversation, became unnaturally still. Even the grandfather clock in the hall, seemed louder than before, each measured tick emphasizing the silence that had settled over Ashcombe House. Clara Finch still held the unopened envelope addressed to Eleanor Ashcombe. Her fingers tightened almost unconsciously around it. "What happened?" asked Richard Ashcombe, breaking the silence. The constable removed his cap. "Dr. Bennett was found beside Mill Bridge about half an hour ago. A farm laborer discovered him lying on the footpath." "Is he alive?" Clara asked. "For the moment, yes. He's unconscious and has been taken to St. Bartholomew's Hospital." The room released a collective breath. "Was it an accident?" someone ventured. The constable hesitated. "The doctor appears to have suffered a blow to the back of the head." Another silence followed. No one needed him to finish the sentence. Someone had attacked him. Outside, dark clouds rolled across the sky, dimming the afternoon sunlight. The pleasant warmth that had accompanied Eleanor Ashcombe's funeral disappeared beneath a sharp autumn wind. Mrs. Jane Marlowe watched the changing weather through the drawing-room window. Storms often arrived without warning in September. So, she reflected, did unpleasant truths. She noticed Philip Grayson staring toward the envelope still resting in Clara's hands. His attention lingered there only briefly before he looked away. Curious, very curious. Inspector Daniel Harcourt arrived less than 20 minutes later. Unlike many detectives from larger towns, Harcourt understood village life well enough to know that everyone possessed information, even those who insisted they had none. He was in his early 40s, calm, neatly dressed, and carried himself with quiet confidence. After introducing himself, he addressed the assembled guests. "I realize today has already been difficult for everyone. Nevertheless, I'd appreciate it if no one leaves until I've spoken with each of you." No one objected, although several people clearly wished to. Mrs. Marlowe quietly poured herself another cup of tea. She had long observed that conversations improved dramatically when people believed they were waiting. Waiting made people restless. Restlessness encouraged talking. The inspector began with Richard. "When did you last see Dr. Bennett?" "This afternoon." "Where?" "Here." "What were you discussing?" Richard shrugged. "Mayan's health. Nothing more." "Were you alone?" "For a few minutes." "Did anyone overhear?" "I couldn't say." His answers were smooth. Perhaps too smooth. Inspector Harcourt made a brief note. Next came Clara. She answered every question carefully. "Did Dr. Bennett seem worried today?" She hesitated. "Not exactly worried." "What then?" "He seemed distracted." "In what way?" "He kept looking toward Mr. Grayson during the reception." The solicitor looked up. "I wasn't aware of that." Clara nodded politely. It may have meant nothing. Mrs. Marlowe silently disagreed. People rarely watch one another for no reason. As interviews continued, villagers gathered in small groups throughout the house. Conversation, once restrained by respect for the funeral, slowly transformed into speculation. Mrs. Edith Palmer lowered her voice. "First Eleanor dies, and now Dr. Bennett is attacked. Surely they're connected." Her companion frowned. "But why?" "No one attacks doctors." Mrs. Palmer replied with remarkable certainty. "They do if doctors know something." Mrs. Marlowe wandered into the conservatory. Glass walls overlooked Eleanor's carefully maintained gardens. Even in fading light, they appeared immaculate. Nothing had been neglected, nothing left untended, except, near the stone path, one flower bed had recently been disturbed. Not by weather, not by animals. The soil had been turned over within the past day or two. She stepped closer. Someone had replanted 3 white chrysanthemums. The flowers themselves appeared perfectly healthy, yet the surrounding earth remained noticeably darker than elsewhere. Fresh. She made no attempt to investigate further. Gardens, she had often found, possessed remarkable memories. If something had been hidden or removed, it rarely remained secret forever. A knock sounded behind her. Inspector Harcourt entered. "Finding anything interesting?" Mrs. Marlowe smiled. "I was admiring Miss Ashcombe's gardening. I've heard she was very particular." Indeed, she looked once more toward the freshly disturbed flower bed. People who value order usually dislike surprises. The inspector followed her gaze. "You've noticed something?" only that gardeners generally dislike replanting flowers twice. He regarded the flower bed thoughtfully. "I'll have someone examine it." She simply nodded. Observation was enough. Others could perform the digging. Inside the library, Philip Grayson finally addressed the unopened letter. "I believe," he said, "that we should wait before opening it." Richard frowned. "Why?" It was addressed to Eleanor. "She's dead. Legally, her correspondence becomes part of her estate." Richard folded his arms. "So we're waiting for legal procedure?" "I am suggesting caution." Caution about a letter? Before the discussion could continue, Inspector Harcourt entered. "I understand there's some post." Clara handed him the envelope. The inspector examined it carefully. No return address. No. Recognized the handwriting. Every person in the room looked at it. No one answered immediately. Then Colonel Haversham spoke. "It seems oddly familiar. Can you place it?" "I'm afraid not." The inspector slipped the envelope into an evidence folder. "We'll examine it later." Richard appeared dissatisfied. Mrs. Marlowe noticed. Some people disliked unanswered questions. Others feared answered ones. As evening settled over Street Aldwyn, rain finally began to fall. The first drops struck the conservatory roof like scattered pebbles before becoming a steady rhythm. Guests gradually received permission to leave. Motor cars disappeared one by one into the mist. Ashcombe House became quiet again, far quieter than it had been all day. Mrs. Marlowe prepared to leave when Clara caught up with her near the front door. "I'm glad you stayed. I wasn't certain I was helping." "You were." Clara hesitated. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think all this has anything to do with Eleanor?" Mrs. Marlowe considered the question carefully. "I think," she said at last, "that coincidences are rather uncommon." Clara lowered her eyes. "There was something strange during Eleanor's last week." Mrs. Marlowe waited. "Twice," Clara continued quietly, "I found her sitting alone in the library after midnight." "Was that unusual?" "Very." "What was she doing?" "Reading the same letter." "The one that arrived today?" "No, a different one." "Did you see who sent it?" Clara slowly shook her head. "She folded it away before I could. And afterward, she asked me a very odd question." "What was it?" "Clara," she said, "if someone wished to correct an injustice after many years, would it always be too late?" Rain beat harder against the windows. Mrs. Marlowe looked toward the dark silhouette of Ashcombe House. People rarely asked such questions without reason. Somewhere inside that house lay the answer. And perhaps the reason someone had tried to silence Dr. Bennet before he could speak. Far across the village, hidden by the gathering darkness, a solitary figure watched the lights glowing from the upper windows of Ashcombe House. After a long moment, the figure turned away and disappeared into the rain. The unopened letter remained locked inside Inspector Harcourt's evidence case. Whatever words it contained had already frightened someone enough to resort to violence. Whether they would also lead to murder remained to be seen. Chapter 3. The letter is opened. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds, and with it came the peculiar silence that often followed a village tragedy. St. Aldwyn appeared unchanged to anyone passing through. Smoke rose from chimneys, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and gardeners paused to admire late-blooming roses that had survived the night's rain. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the morning lay an unmistakable tension. No conversation lasted more than a minute before turning to Eleanor Ashcombe, or to Dr. Harold Bennet, or to the mysterious letter that no one had yet been allowed to read. The attack on the village doctor had spread through Street Aldwyn faster than the church bells ever could. By breakfast, every cottage had its own explanation, each theory delivered with absolute confidence and very little evidence. Mrs. Wilcox declared the doctor had interrupted thieves. The butcher insisted it must have been a stranger. The postmaster quietly remarked that strangers seldom knew exactly where lonely footpaths crossed the river after dusk. That observation silenced several listeners. In villages, people knew the difference between coincidence and familiarity. Inspector Daniel Harcourt reached the police station shortly after 7 o'clock. The evidence envelope lay exactly where he had left it the previous evening. He examined it once more before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, folded twice. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate. Every letter appeared carefully formed, suggesting someone accustomed to writing by hand rather than hurried notes. He unfolded the page. The message was brief. Eleanor, you once promised the truth would remain buried. I have learned that promises grow weaker with time. Before another innocent life suffers, meet me where everything began. Thursday, 7 o'clock. Come alone. Burn this letter. There was no signature, only empty space beneath the final sentence. Inspector Harcourt read the letter again, then a third time. Nothing in the words appeared openly threatening. Yet every sentence carried quiet pressure. It assumed Eleanor understood exactly what was being discussed, which meant the writer was someone connected to her past. Sergeant Collins entered carrying a fresh report. The hospital telephoned. The doctor, still unconscious. No improvement. The surgeon believes he'll recover. Harcourt nodded slowly. Then someone failed. Collins looked puzzled. Sir, if the attacker merely wished to frighten Dr. Bennett, a shove would have been enough. Whoever struck him intended to prevent him from speaking. The inspector folded the letter carefully. And that means whatever Dr. Bennett knew is probably connected to this. Ashcombe House felt different in daylight. Without funeral guests filling its rooms, the silence became more noticeable. Every clock ticked distinctly. Every floorboard carried the memory of footsteps that had disappeared. Clara Finch stood in the breakfast room, arranging fresh flowers when Inspector Harcourt arrived. She looked as though she had barely slept. I've come to ask a few more questions. Of course. She led him into Eleanor's library. The room remained exactly as Eleanor had kept it. Books stood in perfect order. The writing desk faced the garden. The curtains had been opened to admit pale morning light. Harcourt placed the letter upon the desk. I'd like you to read this. Clara unfolded the page carefully. As she reached the second sentence, her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. You've seen something like this before, the inspector said quietly. She hesitated. Not these exact words, but a week before she died, Miss Ashcombe received another letter. You mentioned that yesterday. I didn't tell you everything. Please do now. Clara looked toward the rain-speckled window. I entered the library quite late one evening. What time? Nearly midnight. Was Miss Ashcombe still awake? Yes. What was she doing? Reading a letter. Did she hide it? Immediately. And afterward? Clara paused for several seconds. She asked me a question. What question? Clara, she said, do you think people can ever truly escape the consequences of old mistakes? Inspector Harcourt wrote the sentence into his notebook. What did you answer? I told her everyone deserves forgiveness. And Miss Ashcombe? She smiled. Did she agree? No. Later that morning, Jane Marlowe accepted Mrs. Dobson's invitation for tea. The elderly housekeeper had served at Ashcombe House for nearly 30 years. If anyone understood the household, it was she. Mrs. Dobson poured tea carefully before speaking. The house feels empty. It always does after a funeral, Jane replied. This is different. How so? The housekeeper stirred her tea without looking up. Miss Ashcombe wasn't frightened easily. Jane waited, but during her final fortnight, yes. She began locking doors that she'd never locked before. Did she say why? No. Anything else? Mrs. Dobson nodded slowly. She stopped taking evening walks. Had she always walked? Every evening at 6. And then suddenly stopped? Completely. Jane considered this. Habits seldom changed without reason, especially lifelong habits. After tea, Jane wandered into the library. She admired neither the shelves nor the fireplace. Instead, she examined the room itself. The placement of chairs, the angle of the writing desk, the view through the window. People often revealed their thinking through arrangement rather than decoration. Her attention settled upon a framed photograph resting beside the mantel. For people stood smiling in a garden. Eleanor Ashcombe, Dr. Bennett, Philip Grayson, and a fourth figure. Except the fourth face had been scratched so thoroughly that it could no longer be recognized. Jane lifted the frame. The damage had not resulted from age. Someone had deliberately destroyed only that face. Curious, if one wished to forget a person, why leave the photograph at all? Inspector Harcourt entered quietly behind her. "You found something?" "I found a question." She handed him the frame. He frowned. This wasn't accidental. No, whoever damaged it wanted one person erased, but not the memory of the gathering itself. The inspector turned the frame over. Nothing had been written on the back. No names. Jane smiled faintly. People rarely destroy what has no importance. Richard Ashcombe arrived shortly before noon. He appeared composed, though noticeably impatient. "Inspector," he said, "have you learned anything useful?" "A few things." "Such as?" "We're still investigating." Richard sighed. "I appreciate that, but my aunt's estate cannot remain in uncertainty forever." Jane noticed the wording. "Not my aunt. Not her death. The estate." Inspector Harcourt noticed it as well. "You seem anxious to settle matters." "I simply have responsibilities in London." "Of course." Richard glanced toward the writing desk. "Have you searched everything?" "We've searched what is necessary." His eyes rested on the locked top drawer. Only for a moment. Yet Jane saw it. Some people look toward windows when they wish to leave. Others look toward doors. Richard looked toward the locked drawer. That interested her considerably. As the afternoon drew on, rain began once more, soft at first before settling into a steady rhythm against the library windows. Jane stood watching droplets slide slowly down the glass. Suddenly, she noticed something unusual outside. Near the far hedge, beneath an old yew tree, the soil appeared darker than the surrounding ground. Recently disturbed, not by weather, by someone's spade. She said nothing immediately. Instead, she simply committed the sight to memory. The greatest mistake investigators often made, she reflected, was hurrying toward conclusions before collecting enough observations. Outside, someone had buried or unearthed something. Whether it mattered remained to be seen. But in villages like Street Aldwyn, freshly turned earth rarely remained insignificant for long. As thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills, Jane experienced the quiet certainty that the letter had not begun this mystery. It had merely reopened one that someone had believed buried many years before. And somewhere in the village, another person was waiting to discover whether that buried past would remain hidden or finally come to light. Chapter 4. Buried beneath the yew tree, the rain eased shortly before dusk, leaving the gardens of Ashcombe House glistening beneath a sky that could not quite decide between clearing and another storm. Water clung to the roses like tiny crystals, and the gravel paths reflected the fading light in uneven patches. Jane Marlowe remained standing near the library window. Her attention had not left the patch of disturbed earth beneath the old yew tree. It was not merely that the soil appeared freshly turned. It was the manner in which it had been restored. Whoever had done the work had attempted to leave everything exactly as it had been before. The surrounding grass had been carefully pressed back into place, and a few fallen leaves had even been scattered across the spot. It was the work of someone who understood gardens, or someone who understood suspicion. Inspector Daniel Harcourt joined her at the window. "You've been looking at the same place for several minutes." "I have." "You believe something is there?" "I believe someone wanted us to think there wasn't." The inspector smiled faintly. "That sounds like enough reason to investigate." Within half an hour, Sergeant Collins arrived with 2 officers carrying spades. Richard Ashcombe appeared almost immediately. "Surely this is unnecessary." "It may well be," Harcourt replied evenly. "If so, we'll lose nothing but a little time." Richard folded his arms. "I hope your department intends to repair the garden afterward." Mrs. Dobson, standing quietly beneath the veranda, glanced toward Jane. Neither woman spoke. The officers began digging carefully. No one expected a dramatic discovery. Often, investigations produced nothing more than disappointment. 5 inches of damp soil yielded only roots. 8 inches revealed stones. And nearly a foot deep, one officer struck something solid. The sound was unmistakably different. Not stone, wood. The inspector crouched beside the hole. Carefully, Within moments, a small wooden box emerged from the earth. It was no larger than a dictionary, its brass fittings stained green with age. No lock remained, only a broken clasp. Richard stepped forward instinctively. "What is it?" "We're about to find out." Harcourt lifted the lid. Inside lay several bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them rested a leather-bound notebook and a silver pocket watch whose hand had stopped at exactly 7 o'clock. The inspector looked up slowly. No money, no jewelry of value. Jane nodded. People rarely bury sentimental objects. They bury dangerous ones. The letters were carried into the library. Everyone gathered around the large oak table. Inspector Harcourt put on a pair of gloves before examining the contents. The envelopes had yellowed with age. Many were addressed simply to Miss Eleanor Ashcombe. Others bore no addresses at all. Most had been opened decades earlier. The notebook interested him even more. Its leather cover was cracked from years of use. Inside were dated entries written in neat handwriting. Not Eleanor's. Philip Grayson examined the first page from across the table. "I've seen that handwriting before. You recognize it? I believe it belonged to Arthur Pembroke." Jane looked toward him. "Who was Arthur Pembroke?" The solicitor looked surprised. "You've never heard the name?" She shook her head. "He disappeared from the village nearly 28 years ago." Richard frowned. "I've never heard my aunt mention him. Few people do now." Inspector Harcourt looked up. "Disappeared? That was the general belief. What actually happened?" Philip hesitated. No one ever knew. The room became unusually quiet. Jane watched each face in turn. Mrs. Dobson looked genuinely puzzled. Clara appeared thoughtful. Richard seemed impatient. Only Colonel Haversham, who had quietly arrived during the excavation, lowered his eyes at the mention of Arthur Pembroke. Jane noticed. "Whodunits." He looked up. "You knew him. We serve on the parish council together." "What kind of man was he?" The colonel answered slowly. "Honest. Well-liked. Mostly." And then he left, without explanation, so everyone believed. The hesitation before the final sentence lasted barely a heartbeat. Jane heard it nonetheless. Inspector Harcourt opened the notebook. Most pages contained ordinary observations. Village meetings, harvest accounts, names, dates. Then one entry caught his attention. September 18th, Eleanor says silence protects everyone. I fear silence protects only the guilty. Nothing more. No explanation. No names. Just that single remark. Jane leaned forward slightly. "May I?" The inspector handed her the notebook. She turned several pages. Another entry appeared weeks later. "Someone has begun following me after dark." The handwriting changed slightly there. Less confident, more hurried. Then, several pages afterward, "If anything happens to me, Eleanor knows the truth." Jane closed the notebook gently. No one spoke. The silence ended when Clara quietly asked, "Why would Miss Ashcombe bury these?" Inspector Harcourt answered before anyone else could. "We don't yet know that she did." Richard looked surprised. "You think someone else buried them?" "It's possible. The box was on my aunt's property, which means only that it ended up there." Jane agreed. People often assume ownership and location are the same thing. The inspector smiled. "Precisely." That evening, Harcourt visited St. Matthew's Church. The Reverend Thomas Elwood was arranging him books when the inspector entered. "I hope you might remember Arthur Pembroke." The Reverend stopped what he was doing. "I remember him very well." "What became of him?" The vicar sighed. "That depends whom you ask. I'd rather ask you." He announced he intended to leave for Canada. "And did he?" No ship records ever confirmed it. The inspector looked thoughtful. "Was anyone concerned?" "For a little while. And then—" The Reverend gave a sad smile. Life continued. People forgot. They tried. Back at Ashcombe House, Jane wandered through the library once more. Her eyes settled upon Eleanor's writing desk. The locked drawer still remained unopened. She examined the brass keyhole. Tiny scratches surrounded it. Fresh scratches. Someone had recently attempted to force it open. Not successfully, but recently. She called quietly, "Inspector." He crossed the room. "What is it?" She pointed. "Those marks weren't made years ago." He bent closer. "No, someone tried this lock. Since Eleanor died?" I think so. Richard entered the room at that exact moment. What are you looking at? Inspector Harcourt straightened. The desk. Richard glanced briefly toward the drawer before looking away. Jane noticed the movement. It lasted less than a second. Sometimes less than a second was enough. Night settled over Street Aldwyn once again. Rain clouds finally drifted eastward, revealing a clear sky filled with cold autumn stars. The village appeared peaceful. Too peaceful. Inspector Harcourt carried the notebook and letters back to the station, intending to study them the following morning. He locked them securely inside the evidence cabinet before leaving for the night. Across the village, however, another person had also been watching the police station. From the shadow of an elm tree, hidden beyond the reach of the street lamp, the figure remained motionless until every light inside the building had been extinguished. Only then did the stranger turn away. Whatever had been buried beneath the yew tree had survived nearly 3 decades. Now it was in police hands, and someone, somewhere in St. Aldwyn, had just realized that the past was no longer safely hidden. Chapter 5. Echoes of the past. The following morning broke with clear skies for the first time in several days. A thin mist lingered over the meadows surrounding Street Aldwyn, softening the outlines of distant hedgerows and stone walls. The village appeared peaceful once again, but appearances had begun to lose their value. By now, nearly everyone knew that the police had uncovered a box buried beneath the old yew tree at Ashcombe House. No one knew what had been inside it. That absence of knowledge proved more powerful than any confirmed fact. Rumors multiplied before breakfast. At the post office, Mrs. Palmer insisted the box contained stolen money. The blacksmith claimed it had held wartime documents. Someone else whispered that Eleanor Ashcombe had hidden evidence against a member of the village decades earlier. Each version differed. Each storyteller sounded entirely convinced. Jane Marlowe had long believed that gossip rarely revealed the truth directly. It revealed something equally useful. It showed what people were most afraid might be true. Inspector Daniel Harcourt arrived at the station shortly after 8. The evidence cabinet remained locked. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nevertheless, habit compelled him to inspect everything carefully before sitting at his desk. The letters recovered from the wooden box lay exactly as he had left them. He untied the faded blue ribbon surrounding the first bundle. Most of the correspondence concerned ordinary village matters, charity events, church repairs, harvest collections, and local meetings. Nothing remarkable, nothing secret. Then, halfway through the second bundle, he discovered an envelope that had never been opened. Its paper had yellowed with age. Across the front appeared only 3 words. To Arthur Pembroke. The handwriting was Eleanor's. Harcourt frowned. If Eleanor had written the letter, why had Arthur never opened it? Or had he never received it? He carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The ink had faded but remained legible. Arthur, you're making a terrible mistake. Speaking now will help no one. It will only destroy lives that cannot be rebuilt. I beg you to leave matters as they are until I can persuade the others to do what is right. Please trust me one last time. Eleanor, no date. No signature beyond her first name. No indication whether the letter had ever been posted. The inspector leaned back thoughtfully. The others. The phrase lingered in his mind. Not another person. Not someone else. The others. Arthur Pembroke had not been arguing with Eleanor alone. There had been a group. By mid-morning, Jane Marlowe received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Bernard Haversham stood at her front gate carrying a neatly wrapped tin of shortbread. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. She welcomed him inside. The colonel removed his hat before settling into the chair opposite the fireplace. I've been thinking, that can be dangerous. He smiled faintly. It often is. Jane poured tea without hurrying him. People rarely reached the important part of a conversation immediately. The silence between subjects often mattered just as much as the words themselves. Finally, the colonel spoke. I wasn't entirely honest yesterday. I suspected as much. He nodded. When Arthur Pembroke disappeared, there were 4 of us who met privately. Jane remained silent. Encouragement, she had found, was usually more effective when expressed through patience than interruption. The meetings included Eleanor Ashcombe, Philip Grayson, Harold Bennett, and myself. And Arthur, he attended until the final meeting. What were the meetings about? The colonel looked toward the window. I cannot tell you. You cannot. I gave my word. Jane stirred her tea slowly. To whom? Eleanor. And do you believe that promise still binds you? The colonel answered almost immediately. Until yesterday I did. The distinction interested her. What changed yesterday? The notebook. You recognized it. Yes. And he sighed deeply. Arthur believed silence protected the wrong people. Jane remembered the line written inside the notebook. Silence protects only the guilty. At the time, it had seemed merely thoughtful. Now it sounded like the beginning of an accusation. Inspector Harcourt spent the afternoon tracing Arthur Pembroke's final known movements. The village records offered surprisingly little. 28 years earlier, Arthur had resigned from the parish council. A week later, he had sold his cottage. The sale, however, had never been completed. No forwarding address existed. No bank activity appeared after his disappearance. No death certificate had ever been issued. Officially, Arthur Pembroke had simply ceased to exist. The inspector disliked incomplete records. People rarely vanished without leaving administrative traces, unless someone wanted those traces to disappear. Meanwhile, Clara Finch continued sorting Eleanor's personal belongings. The task proved more emotional than she had expected. Every drawer contained neatly labeled envelopes. Every cupboard reflected Eleanor's lifelong preference for order. Inside a small mahogany cabinet, Clara discovered several photograph albums. Most contained familiar village scenes stretching back decades. Church fetes, harvest suppers, school concerts. Then one photograph slipped loose from between the pages. It landed face down upon the carpet. Clara picked it up. Her breath caught. It showed the same 4 people as the damaged photograph in the library. This copy, however, had never been scratched. Eleanor stood smiling beside Philip Grayson. Colonel Haversham stood to one side. Dr. Bennett appeared several years younger. And between them stood a 5th person, Arthur Pembroke. The back of the photograph contained a handwritten note. Village Restoration Committee, June 1998. Nothing more. No explanation. Yet Clara immediately noticed something odd. Everyone else smiled toward the camera. Arthur did not. Instead, he was looking at Eleanor. Not warmly, not angrily, simply, expectantly, as though waiting for her to make a decision. Clara carried the photograph directly to Inspector Harcourt. He examined it with obvious interest. So this is Arthur Pembroke. It appears so. And now we know why the other photograph was damaged. He compared the 2 images side by side. Someone had scratched away only Arthur's face. Every other detail remained untouched. Whoever did this, Harcourt murmured, wanted people to forget Arthur without destroying the photograph itself. Jane, who had accompanied Clara to the station, studied both pictures carefully. I wonder. The inspector looked up. What? If the photograph in the library was altered after Eleanor's death? He frowned. What makes you think that? Because the frame was spotless. I don't follow. Dust gathers evenly. She pointed toward the damaged frame. The back had recently been opened. Harcourt looked again. She was right. Tiny fingerprints marked the inside edge of the wooden backing. Someone had removed the photograph, damaged it, then carefully replaced it. Recently, not decades ago. Late that afternoon, Sergeant Collins entered the inspector's office carrying another report. We've spoken with the surgeon. Dr. Bennett, he's regained consciousness. Harcourt stood immediately. Can he speak? For short periods. Good. The inspector reached for his coat. If anyone can explain what connects Eleanor Ashcombe to Arthur Pembroke, it may be Harold Bennett. The hospital room overlooked quiet fields washed in golden evening light. Dr. Bennett appeared pale and exhausted, a thick bandage wrapped around his head. He managed a faint smile as Harcourt entered. I expected you. I imagine you did. The inspector pulled up a chair. I won't keep you long. The doctor nodded. You found something? We found Arthur Pembroke's notebook. For the first time, genuine alarm crossed the doctor's face. His hand tightened around the blanket. You shouldn't have. Why not? Dr. Bennett closed his eyes briefly. Because if that notebook has been found, he stopped. Then whoever attacked me will know the rest cannot remain hidden. The rest of what? The doctor looked toward the hospital door before answering. There was never just one secret. Inspector Harcourt leaned forward. What do you mean? Dr. Bennett spoke so quietly that the words were almost lost beneath the steady ticking of the wall clock. There were 5 of us. The inspector remained silent. Eleanor, Philip, Bernard, Arthur, and me. We all made the same promise. What promise? The doctor's expression filled with regret. To protect someone. Who? Before he could answer, a nurse hurried into the room. I am sorry, Inspector. That's enough for today. The doctor needs to rest. Harcourt reluctantly stood. I'll return tomorrow. Dr. Bennett gave the slightest nod. As the inspector reached the door, the doctor called after him in a weak voice. Inspector. He turned. Don't assume Eleanor was protecting herself. What was she protecting? The doctor looked toward the window, where the last light of evening had begun to fade. She believed she was protecting an innocent person. The room fell silent. Walking back through the hospital corridor, Harcourt realized the investigation had shifted once again. For days, everyone had searched for a motive rooted in greed, inheritance, or revenge. Now another possibility had emerged. Perhaps Eleanor Ashcombe had spent nearly 30 years guarding a secret she believed would save someone else. The troubling question was no longer what had happened all those years ago. It was whether that person still needed protecting, or whether someone had been willing to kill to ensure the truth never emerged. Chapter 6. The 5th promise. The drive back from St. Bartholomew's Hospital was quieter than Inspector Daniel Harcourt expected. The road wound through open fields where the morning mist had finally surrendered to pale autumn sunshine. Sheep grazed lazily beyond dry stone walls, and the hedgerows glowed with berries that would soon attract winter birds. It was the sort of peaceful countryside that invited reflection. Yet the inspector found little comfort in the landscape. Dr. Harold Bennett's final words echoed repeatedly in his mind. Don't assume Eleanor was protecting herself. It changed everything. Until that moment, the investigation had centered on Eleanor Ashcombe as the keeper of a dangerous secret. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps she had been carrying someone else's burden all along. When Harcourt reached the police station, Jane Marlowe was already waiting. She sat beside the window with a cup of tea Sergeant Collins had thoughtfully prepared, studying a village map spread neatly across the inspector's desk. You've been busy, Harcourt remarked. I dislike waiting when there are questions to consider. You found something? Not found. She smiled gently. I've noticed something. The inspector removed his coat. I'm listening. Jane pointed to 5 locations marked lightly in pencil. Ashcombe House, the church, Mill Bridge, the old village hall, and Blackwood Farm. The first 4 have all appeared during the investigation. The farm hasn't. No, Jane agreed, which is exactly why it interests me. Harcourt looked more closely. Arthur Pembroke lived nearest Blackwood Farm. Yes, and Eleanor often visited the farm for charity work. Quite regularly. The doctor also treated the family there. Jane folded her hands. 5 people made a promise, according to Dr. Bennett. The same number who seemed connected to this part of the village. The inspector leaned back thoughtfully. You're wondering whether the promise began there. I've learned that promises usually begin somewhere very ordinary. That afternoon, Harcourt drove to Blackwood Farm. The farmhouse stood at the end of a narrow lane lined with ancient oaks whose branches nearly touched overhead. It had once been among the largest farms in the district. Now only part of the land remained in use. The owner, Samuel Blackwood, was 83 and walked with the aid of 2 canes. He welcomed the inspector politely into a sitting room overlooking the orchards. I understand you've been asking about Eleanor. I have. Samuel nodded sadly. A fine woman. You knew her well, since we were children. And Arthur Pembroke, the old farmer, looked down at the fire. I wondered how long it would be before someone asked that. You remember him? Very well. What sort of man was he? Honest. The answer came immediately. So others have said. Samuel gave a tired smile. Honest men often make uncomfortable neighbors. The inspector waited. They asked questions, and Arthur asked too many. Perhaps. The old farmer reached slowly toward a shelf beside his chair. From it, he removed a faded photograph. It showed a summer fete held decades earlier. Children raced across the village green, while adults laughed beneath colorful bunting. Samuel pointed toward the edge of the photograph. There, the inspector followed his finger. 5 young adults stood together. Eleanor, Arthur, Harold Bennett, Bernard Haversham, Philip Grayson. No one else. They were inseparable once, Samuel said quietly. What happened? The old man looked toward the window. I've asked myself that question for 30 years. Meanwhile, Clara Finch continued organizing Eleanor's study. The locked drawer still resisted every attempt to open it. Rather than force it, she carefully examined the desk itself. It had been crafted by a local cabinet maker nearly 50 years earlier. Running her fingers beneath the writing surface, she noticed something unusual. A narrow groove, almost invisible. She pressed gently. Nothing happened. She tried again from a different angle. A faint click answered. One side panel slid open no more than 2 inches. Hidden inside rested a single brass key. Clara stared at it. Not the key to the drawer. A much smaller one. Attached to it by faded string was a handwritten label. Archive room, she frowned. Ashcombe House possessed no room by that name. At least none she had ever seen. Jane Marlowe arrived just as Clara was examining the key. You found something? I think so. Clara handed it to her. Jane studied the tiny label. Archive room. There isn't one. Perhaps not anymore. Mrs. Dobson entered carrying fresh tea. Jane held up the key. Does this mean anything to you? The housekeeper adjusted her spectacles. It certainly does. Both women looked at her. There used to be an archive room. Used to. It was closed years ago. Where? In the attic. I've never seen it. Because the staircase was sealed after the roof repairs. Jane exchanged a glance with Clara. When was that? Mrs. Dobson thought carefully. About 27. No, 28 years ago. Exactly the same period. By late afternoon, Inspector Harcourt returned to Ashcombe House. Jane showed him the key. His eyebrows rose. I don't suppose anyone mentioned an archive room before today. No. Mrs. Dobson led them upstairs. At the end of a long corridor stood what appeared to be an ordinary linen cupboard. She pushed several shelves aside. Behind them was an old oak door nearly hidden beneath layers of paint. There, the inspector inserted the small brass key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lock turned with surprising ease. The hinges groaned softly as the door opened inward. A narrow staircase climbed into darkness. Dust floated through the beam of Harcourt's flashlight. No footprints marked the steps. No one's been up here in years, Sergeant Collins observed. So it would seem. The small attic room proved larger than expected. Shelves lined every wall. Boxes stood neatly labeled. Church accounts, village records, charity ledgers, election notices. Everything Eleanor had carefully preserved over decades. Jane walked slowly through the room. Nothing appeared disturbed, except one shelf. A single storage box was missing. The empty space remained plainly visible. Inspector Harcourt noticed it immediately. There should be something here. Jane nodded, and someone removed it. Recently, she pointed toward the dust. Every nearby shelf carried an even gray layer. The empty space did not. It can't have been gone long. Sergeant Collins searched the remaining boxes. Most contained perfectly ordinary documents. Minutes of parish meetings, old newspapers, festival programs. Then he opened a smaller tin case tucked into the corner. Inside lay 5 identical envelopes. Each bore a handwritten name. Eleanor Ascombe Arthur Pembroke Philippe Grayson Bernard Avercham Harovenet, no addresses. Only names. The envelopes had never been opened. Inspector Harcourt examined them carefully. Interesting. Jane looked thoughtful. 5 people. The same 5. He carefully opened Eleanor's envelope. Inside rested only a single playing card. The Queen of Hearts. Nothing else. Sergeant Collins opened Arthur's. The King of Clubs. Philip's contained the ace of diamonds. Bernard's, the jack of spades. Harold's, the 10 of hearts. The inspector frowned. What on earth does this mean? Jane gently picked up the queen of hearts. I don't know. She looked at the remaining envelopes. But I'm quite certain these were left as reminders. Reminders of what? She smiled faintly. That's the wrong question. What is the right one? She laid the cards side by side. Why did Eleanor preserve them for nearly 30 years? As evening settled over St. Aldwyn, another message reached the police station. Dr. Bennett had insisted upon seeing Inspector Harcourt as soon as possible. The request had been marked urgent. Harcourt folded the notice into his pocket. I'll leave first thing in the morning. Jane nodded. I hope you're not too late. He looked at her. You think someone's moving faster than we are? I think, she replied quietly, that whoever buried one secret has just discovered we are uncovering another. Outside, unnoticed by anyone inside Ashcombe House, a lone figure stood beyond the garden wall. The attic window glowed faintly against the darkening sky. The figure watched for several moments before turning silently toward the lane. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a gate clicked shut. And for the second time since Eleanor Ashcombe's funeral, someone else had decided that the past had remained buried long enough. Chapter 7. A voice silenced Inspector Daniel Harcourt left for St. Bartholomew's Hospital before sunrise. A pale mist lay across the countryside, softening every hedge and stone wall into vague silhouettes. The road was almost deserted, save for a milk lorry making its morning deliveries and a solitary cyclist disappearing into the fog. He drove faster than he normally would. Dr. Harold Bennett had insisted on seeing him urgently. Whatever the doctor intended to reveal had waited nearly 3 decades. The inspector hoped it could wait another hour. As he turned into the hospital grounds, however, he saw 2 police vehicles already parked outside the main entrance. His heart sank. A uniformed constable hurried toward him. Inspector, what has happened? The young officer hesitated. Dr. Bennett disappeared during the night. Harcourt stared at him. Disappeared? He was in his room at midnight. And now, the bed is empty. The hospital administrator looked deeply embarrassed. We simply don't understand it. Inspector Harcourt examined the room himself. The window remained locked from the inside. The bed sheets had been folded back neatly. Dr. Bennett's slippers still rested beside the bed. His coat hung inside the wardrobe. Nothing suggested a hurried departure. The only unusual detail was a single chair positioned beside the window. The curtain had been pulled slightly aside, as though someone had stood there watching the ground below. A nurse entered quietly. I was the last person to see him. What time? Just after 11:30. How was he? Tired? Did he say anything? She thought for a moment. Only one thing. What? He asked whether the police had found the 6th item. Inspector Harcourt frowned. The 6th item? Those were his exact words. He thanked her and made a careful note. 5 envelopes. 5 people. 5 promises. What could a 6th item possibly be? Back in St. Aldwyn, Jane Marlowe sat in the garden behind her cottage, trimming lavender while considering the latest developments. Gardening had always helped her think. Plants, unlike people, seldom pretended to be something they were not. A knock sounded at the garden gate. Colonel Bernard Haversham stood waiting. His usually steady expression carried unmistakable concern. I've just heard about Harold. So have I. He wouldn't have left willingly. Jane laid her shears upon the table. You sound certain. I am. Why? Because Harold never broke promises. Jane studied him quietly, yet someone clearly expected him to remain silent. The colonel removed his gloves slowly. There are things I should have said years ago. There usually are. I believe silence would spare innocent people. And now, he looked toward the distant church spire. I'm no longer sure who the innocent people are. Later that afternoon, Inspector Harcourt returned to Ashcombe House. Sergeant Collins was already waiting in the library. We've searched Dr. Bennett's house. Anything, very little. The sergeant placed a small leather notebook upon the desk. It was hidden behind medical journals. Unlike Arthur Pembroke's notebook, this one contained very few entries. Most pages were blank. Only the final section had been used. The first written page contained a date from nearly 28 years earlier. Beneath it appeared one sentence. We agreed never to speak of the accident. The next page read, Arthur believes it was no accident. Then several blank pages followed. Near the end appeared another entry. If Eleanor ever changes her mind, everything changes with it. Inspector Harcourt closed the notebook slowly. So Arthur believed something had been covered up. Jane nodded, and Eleanor believed silence remained necessary. What if Arthur was right? Then someone has been protecting a lie. Clara Finch spent the afternoon cataloging documents from the attic archive. Most proved disappointingly ordinary. Church accounts, insurance papers, old festival programs. Then she discovered a folded village map tucked inside an account ledger. Several locations had been marked in blue ink. Ashcombe House, Mill Bridge, the Old Quarry, Blackwood Farm, and one final place, Hawthorne Cottage. Clara frowned. The cottage had stood empty for years. She carried the map downstairs. Jane examined it carefully. Do you know who lived there? Mrs. Dobson answered from the doorway. The Pembrokes. Jane looked up. Arthur's family? Mrs. Dobson nodded. They left after Arthur disappeared. No one bought the house. It has belonged to the estate ever since. Inspector Harcourt traced the circle around Hawthorne Cottage with his finger. I think we should pay it a visit. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, half hidden behind overgrown hedges and ancient ash trees. Its windows were coated with years of dust. Ivy climbed one wall almost to the chimney. The front gate hung crooked on rusted hinges. Sergeant Collins forced the swollen front door open. The air inside smelled of damp timber and forgotten years. Furniture remained beneath white sheets. A clock stood frozen at 4:10. Everything appeared untouched. Yet Jane noticed something almost immediately. There, she pointed toward the fireplace. The ash inside looked surprisingly fresh. Inspector Harcourt crouched beside it. You think someone's been here recently? I think someone lit a fire. But why? He sifted gently through the ashes. Among them lay the blackened corner of a document. Only a few words had escaped the flames. Meeting, Thursday, bridge. Nothing more. Whoever had burned the paper had done so carefully. Too carefully. As Sergeant Collins searched the upstairs rooms, a shout echoed from above. Inspector! They hurried up the narrow staircase. In the smallest bedroom stood an old wardrobe. Behind it, concealed within the wall, was a shallow compartment. Inside rested a small tin box. Unlike the one buried beneath the yew tree, this box contained no letters. Only a brass key, a newspaper clipping, and a folded piece of paper. The clipping reported the death of a local schoolmaster nearly 30 years earlier after what authorities had described as a fall near the old quarry. Jane read the headline twice. Then she looked toward Harcourt. That wasn't Arthur. No, the date. He checked. It happened 6 months before Arthur disappeared. The folded paper proved even stranger. Across it, in Arthur Pembroke's unmistakable handwriting, appeared only one sentence. The wrong man was buried. No explanation, no names, just 7 words. The room fell completely silent. As dusk settled over Hawthorne Cottage, Inspector Harcourt stood looking through the dusty window toward the lane outside. So, he said quietly, we now have an accident, another death, Arthur's disappearance, Eleanor's letters, and Harold's disappearance. Jane remained thoughtful. They're not separate events. I agree. What troubles me, she continued, is that every answer creates 2 new questions. The inspector smiled faintly. That seems to happen rather often. She folded Arthur's note carefully. The sentence doesn't say the wrong person died. No, it says the wrong man was buried. Harcourt looked at her. You think Arthur meant that literally? I haven't decided. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the abandoned garden. A cool wind stirred the long grass. Neither Jane nor the inspector noticed the faint movement beyond the hedge. Someone had been watching the cottage since their arrival. As the last light faded from the sky, the unseen observer slipped quietly away, carrying one unsettling realization. The investigators had come far closer to the truth than anyone had expected. And if Arthur Pembroke's final message was correct, then the greatest deception in St. Aldwyn had not been a murder. It had begun with a grave. Chapter 8. The grave without a secret. The discovery at Hawthorne Cottage cast a long shadow over Street Aldwyn. By the following morning, Inspector Daniel Harcourt had read Arthur Pembroke's final note so many times that the paper had begun to soften along its folds. The wrong man was buried. 7 simple words. No explanation. No names. Yet they altered the direction of the investigation more profoundly than any evidence uncovered so far. The inspector spread every significant document across the table in his office. Arthur's notebook, Dr. Bennett's journal, the anonymous letters sent to Eleanor, the photograph of the 5 friends, the playing cards recovered from the attic. Now Arthur's final message. Individually, each item hinted at a mystery. Together, they suggested something far older than Eleanor Ashcombe's death. Someone had carefully preserved fragments of story while ensuring no single piece revealed the whole truth. Jane Marlowe arrived shortly after 9, carrying a notebook of her own. I hope I'm not interrupting. Quite the opposite. Harcourt motioned toward the documents. I've been trying to fit these together, and they refused to cooperate. Jane smiled gently. Facts rarely argue with one another. No, they only appear to when one of them has been misunderstood. She studied Arthur's note for several moments before speaking again. Tell me, Inspector, when people hear the word buried, what do they usually imagine? A grave. Exactly. And you think Arthur meant something else? I think he wanted readers to assume he meant a grave. The inspector looked thoughtful. What else can be buried? Documents. Money. Secrets. Promises. She folded her hands. Or identities. That last word lingered in the room. Sergeant Collins entered carrying a thick leather register borrowed from St. Matthew's Church. The parish burial records. Inspector Harcourt thanked him and opened the heavy volume. Its pages stretched back more than a century. Every burial had been recorded with remarkable care. Names, dates, ages, locations within the churchyard. Nothing appeared unusual until they reached the autumn nearly 30 years earlier. One entry had been altered. Not removed, not rewritten, simply corrected. The original name had been crossed out so neatly that it remained partially legible beneath the fresh ink. Harcourt leaned closer. What do you make of that? Jane adjusted her spectacles. The correction wasn't made at the same time. You can tell, the ink has aged differently. The inspector called for a magnifying glass. Under magnification, the first name slowly emerged. Only a few letters remained visible. The corrected entry bore a completely different surname. Inspector Harcourt frowned. Why would anyone alter a burial register years afterward? Jane did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned another page. There, a second correction. Different handwriting. Different ink. The same period. Someone had revised the official record long after the funeral had taken place. That afternoon, they visited Reverend Thomas Elwood. The elderly vicar listened carefully before examining the register himself. I've never noticed these. Were they made before your time? Yes. My predecessor kept these records. Would anyone else have had access? Only the church wardens. Jane glanced toward the old filing cabinet standing against the vestry wall. Do you keep older correspondence? As much as possible. Within minutes, the Reverend produced several worn folders tied with ribbon. Most contained routine church business. One, however, held letters exchanged between the parish and the diocesan office. A letter dated 28 years earlier caught the inspector's attention. He unfolded it carefully. Dear Reverend Miles, your request regarding the correction of parish records has been approved. As discussed, the amendment should remain confidential in order to spare unnecessary distress to the family concerned. Please destroy the earlier draft once the register has been updated. There was no indication which record had been corrected, nor whose family required protection, but the date matched Arthur Pembroke's disappearance almost exactly. Outside the church, Colonel Bernard Haversham waited beside the stone gate. He removed his hat as Jane approached. I had a feeling you'd come here. Were you looking for us? For courage. Jane regarded him quietly. Have you found it? I'm trying. The colonel stared across the churchyard toward the oldest graves. I've spent nearly 30 years believing silence was the honorable choice. And now I fear silence has become cowardice. Inspector Harcourt stepped forward. Colonel, it's time. The older man nodded slowly. I know. He led them toward a weathered stone bench beneath a large cedar tree. When Arthur disappeared, he began, the five of us met one final time. Eleanor, Philip, Harold, Arthur, and yourself. Yes. What happened? The colonel clasped his hands tightly around his walking stick. Arthur wanted the police involved. Why? He believed a terrible mistake had already been made. What mistake? The colonel closed his eyes briefly. I cannot tell you that. Inspector Harcourt frowned. Cannot. I gave Eleanor my word. Jane spoke gently. Coronel. Eleanor is gone. Harold has vanished. Arthur disappeared. The promise you made has already destroyed enough lives. The old soldier looked older than ever. I know. A long silence followed. Finally, he whispered, we weren't protecting a criminal. Who were you protecting? Before he could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the churchyard. Sergeant Collins approached, noticeably out of breath. Inspector, what is it? We've just received a telephone call from the station. Go on. Someone broke into the evidence room. Harcourt's expression hardened. When? Sometime within the last hour. What was taken? That's the strange part. The sergeant unfolded a hastily written inventory. They ignored the money kept for unrelated cases. They ignored watches, wallets, and jewelry. They took only one thing. The letters, the inspector asked. Collins shook his head. No. The notebooks. No. The photograph. No. He looked directly at the inspector. They stole the 5 playing cards. Within 20 minutes, they reached the station. The rear window had been forced open with surprising precision. Whoever entered had known exactly where to go. Nothing lay overturned. No unnecessary damage had been done. The evidence cabinet stood open. Its remaining contents were untouched. Only the envelopes containing the playing cards had disappeared. Inspector Harcourt examined the cabinet carefully. Professional. Jane slowly walked around the room. Her attention settled upon the floor beneath the cabinet. There, a tiny fragment of stiff paper rested against the skirting board. It had escaped the thief's notice. She picked it up carefully. It was not one of the missing cards. It was the corner of an envelope. Only a few handwritten words remained visible. For the 6th, nothing more. Inspector Harcourt looked at her. The nurse. Jane nodded. Dr. Bennett asked whether the police had found the 6th item. And now someone has stolen the first 5. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Jane quietly said, I don't think those cards were important by themselves. No, I think they were only meant to point towards something else. The 6th item. She folded the paper fragment into her notebook. Exactly. That evening, Jane returned alone to Ashcombe House. The library stood in perfect silence. The fire had burned low, filling the room with the comforting scent of old wood and ash. She walked slowly to Eleanor's writing desk. For several minutes, she simply stood there, looking not at the desk itself, but at the objects Eleanor had chosen to leave upon it. A fountain pen, a blotter, a small brass paperweight shaped like an owl, a calendar still open to the week of her death. Then her eyes settled upon something she had overlooked before. A tiny indentation in the polished leather writing surface. Circular, barely visible, as though a small object had rested there for many years. Something about the size of a pocket watch. Jane remembered the silver watch recovered from beneath the yew tree. Its hands had stopped at exactly 7 o'clock, the same hour mentioned in the anonymous letter. She did not yet know why that mattered. But for the first time since the investigation began, she felt she was no longer collecting unrelated clues. She was beginning to glimpse the outline of the pattern beneath them. Somewhere there was a 6th item, and whoever had stolen the playing cards believed it was still hidden. The unsettling question was no longer whether the mystery could be solved. It was whether the unknown searcher would find the final piece before Jane Marlowe and Inspector Harcourt did. Chapter 9. The sixth item, the following morning, arrived cold and brilliantly clear. For the first time in nearly a week, the church tower stood sharply outlined against a cloudless sky, and the autumn sun cast long golden beams across the village green. Shopkeepers opened their doors, as they always had. Children hurried toward the schoolhouse. Gardeners swept fallen leaves into tidy piles. To a stranger, St. Aldwin appeared entirely ordinary. Inspector Daniel Harcourt knew better. Somewhere within the village, someone had broken into a police station with remarkable precision, ignored valuables worth hundreds of pounds, and stolen 5 ordinary playing cards. No common thief behaved in such a manner. Whoever had entered the evidence room had known exactly what was worth taking. More importantly, they had known exactly where to find it. The inspector assembled his small team before anyone else arrived at the station. The burglars spent less than 5 minutes inside. Sergeant Collins nodded. The neighbors heard nothing. The window, forced with a thin steel tool. No fingerprints. None. Harcourt looked toward the nearly empty evidence cabinet. Then our visitor planned everything. He paused before continuing, which means someone has been watching this investigation from the beginning. The realization settled heavily over the room. Until then, they had assumed they were uncovering an old mystery. Now it appeared the mystery had been watching them in return. Jane Marlowe arrived shortly afterward, carrying the silver pocket watch recovered from the box beneath the yew tree. Inspector Harcourt looked at it with renewed interest. You believe it matters? I believe Eleanor kept nothing without reason. Jane laid the watch carefully upon a desk. It stopped at exactly 7, the same hour mentioned in the anonymous letter. Yes. Harcourt opened the back cover. Inside, where one might expect an engraving, he found only 2 carefully scratched initials. A.P. Arthur Pembroke. Jane nodded. But look more closely. The inspector tilted the watch beneath the morning light. Along the inside rim, almost invisible without magnification, another inscription appeared. Return when the clock speaks. He frowned. The clock speaks. It sounds absurd, unless it meant something to Arthur. Jane smiled thoughtfully. Or to Eleanor. By midday, they returned to Ashcombe House. The library remained exactly as it had been left the previous evening. Jane placed the watch upon the leather writing surface. For several minutes, nothing happened. She looked slowly around the room. Every clock in the house had always fascinated Eleanor. Not because she valued punctuality above all else. Because she insisted every clock be wound every Sunday afternoon without fail. Mrs. Dobson entered carrying tea. You've noticed the clocks again. Were they always kept running? Oh yes. Even after they became unreliable? The housekeeper laughed softly. Especially then. Why? Miss Ashcombe said a silent clock encouraged people to forget time. Jane repeated the phrase quietly. A silent clock. She looked again at Arthur's watch. Return when the clock speaks. Inspector Harcourt walked toward the tall grandfather clock standing in the entrance hall. It had belonged to Eleanor's father. Its oak case rose almost to the ceiling. Mrs. Dobson produced the winding key from a nearby drawer. It hasn't chimed since the funeral. Has anyone tried winding it? I thought it best to leave everything untouched. The inspector inserted the key and slowly wound the mechanism. A series of quiet clicks echoed inside the case. Then, nothing. The pendulum remained still. Jane stepped closer. The movement is obstructed. Sergeant Collins carefully opened the lower panel. The pendulum hung motionless. Wedged behind it was a narrow leather packet. No one spoke. The sergeant removed it carefully. Someone had hidden it with extraordinary care. Inspector Harcourt untied the faded cord. Inside lay 6 folded sheets of paper. Not 5, 6. Jane looked at him calmly. I believe we've just found Dr. Bennett's 6th item. Each sheet bore a different name. Eleanor Ashcombe, Arthur Pembroke, Harold Bennett, Philip Grayson, Bernard Haversham. The 6th carried no name at all. Only a single wax seal that had never been broken. Inspector Harcourt examined the first 5. Each contained a handwritten statement. Not letters. Not diaries. Statements. Signed. Dated. Witnessed. The handwriting differed on every page. Arthur's statement came first. It described a meeting held 28 years earlier. The final paragraphs, however, had been deliberately removed with a sharp blade. Someone had cut away nearly half the page. Philip's statement ended in the same manner. So did Bernard's, Harold's, even Eleanor's. Only the beginnings remained. Every document stopped just before revealing whatever had truly happened. Sergeant Collins looked disappointed. They've been ruined. Jane slowly shook her head. No, they've been edited. Inspector Harcourt looked up. By whom? Someone who wished to preserve the existence of the statements, without preserving the truth they contained. Only the sixth document remained unopened. Unlike the others, its wax seal was intact. On its reverse appeared an impression of a tiny oak tree. Mrs. Dobson suddenly drew a sharp breath. I've seen that before. Everyone turned toward her. Where? She hesitated. Miss Ashcombe kept a small wooden stamp. What became of it? I don't know. When did you last see it? The evening before she died. Jane looked thoughtfully toward Eleanor's writing desk. Another missing object. Another piece removed shortly before the funeral. Inspector Harcourt held the sealed document carefully. If we open this, Jane finished the sentence, we may finally understand why someone has been willing to attack one person, frighten another, and steal evidence from a police station. He nodded, but before we do, he looked around the room. I want everyone who has been connected with this affair present. By late afternoon, messages had been delivered throughout the village. Colonel Bernard Haversham arrived first. His expression suggested he already suspected what was coming. Philip Grayson entered only minutes later, carrying his worn leather briefcase. Richard Ashcombe arrived last. He seemed impatient. I was told this couldn't wait. It can't, Harcourt replied. Clara quietly closed the library door behind him. The room fell silent. Upon the table rested the sealed sixth document. No one spoke. Jane studied each face in turn. Richard glanced repeatedly toward the envelope. Philip avoided looking at it altogether. The colonel stared directly at the fire. Clara watched the others rather than the document itself. Interesting, Jane thought. Very interesting. Fear seldom revealed itself in the same way twice. Before Inspector Harcourt could break the wax seal, the telephone in the hallway began ringing. Its sharp sound echoed through the silent house. Mrs. Dobson answered. Moments later she returned, noticeably pale. Inspector. Yes. It's the hospital. Everyone looked toward her. They found Dr. Bennett. A long silence followed. Alive? Harcourt asked. Mrs. Dobson swallowed. No, he was discovered this afternoon in the old boathouse near Blackwater Lake. The room seemed to grow colder. The doctors believe, she continued quietly, he died sometime during the night. Colonel Haversham lowered his head. Clara covered her mouth. Philip Grayson slowly removed his spectacles. Only Richard remained perfectly still. Inspector Harcourt looked toward the unopened sixth document. Whatever answers it contained had now become even more important. Someone had succeeded in silencing the only remaining witness who understood the promise made 28 years earlier. Jane rested one hand lightly upon the sealed envelope. The person responsible, she said softly, has just made their first fatal mistake. Inspector Harcourt looked at her. Why do you say that? Because until today, we were investigating a mystery. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on each face before returning to the envelope. Now we're investigating a murderer who believes the truth is close enough to fear. Outside, the church bell struck 6. Inside the library, no one moved. The wax seal remained unbroken. For nearly 3 decades, it had guarded a secret powerful enough to reshape lives, destroy friendships, and now claim another victim. The moment it was opened, there would be no returning to the quiet life Street Aldwyn had once known. Chapter 10. The last letter. For several long moments, no one in the library spoke. The news of Dr. Harold Bennett's death seemed to absorb every sound in the room. The crackling fire no longer felt comforting, only intrusive, as though it had interrupted something solemn. Inspector Daniel Harcourt looked from one face to another. 28 years of silence had ended with another death. Whatever promise had once united Eleanor Ashcombe, Arthur Pembroke, Harold Bennett, Philip Grayson, and Colonel Bernard Haversham had become something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. At the center of the table lay the sealed sixth document. It was now the only voice left from the past. Harcourt picked it up carefully. "I'm opening it." No one objected. The wax seal broke with a quiet crack. Inside rested a single folded page. Unlike the other statements, this one was complete. There were no missing paragraphs, no cut edges, no damaged sections. Jane Marlowe watched silently as the inspector unfolded the paper. At the top appeared a title: "Statement to be opened only if the truth can no longer be hidden." The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Eleanor Ashcombe. Inspector Harcourt began reading aloud. "If you are reading this, then Harold has failed to keep our promise, or I have died before I could put matters right. 28 years ago, the five of us believed we were protecting an innocent life. We were wrong in believing silence would heal what had happened. Arthur alone insisted that the truth should be told immediately. I persuaded the others that public scandal would destroy a family already broken by tragedy. Arthur disagreed. He left our final meeting intending to go to the police the following morning. He never arrived." The inspector stopped reading. The room had become utterly silent. He continued, "Arthur did not disappear willingly. He discovered evidence that proved the accident at the old quarry had not been an accident at all. Before he could reveal what he knew, someone prevented him. We believed that person had fled forever. We buried the documents, preserved our statements, and swore never to speak unless new evidence appeared. I have lived ever since with the knowledge that silence is sometimes the greatest injustice of all." Jane slowly closed her eyes. She had suspected as much. Not the details, only the shape of the truth. Inspector Harcourt reached the final paragraph. "The person responsible was never a stranger. They attended every meeting. They listened while we argued. They knew where the evidence was hidden because they helped hide it. I can no longer protect them. Their name is Richard Ashcombe." The room seemed to stop. Richard's face lost all color. "No," he whispered. "That isn't possible." Inspector Harcourt looked directly at him. "Your aunt named you." Richard took one slow step backward. "My aunt was mistaken." Jane spoke for the first time. "No." Richard turned sharply. "You don't understand." "I think I do." She stood calmly. Eleanor spent years believing she was protecting a frightened young man who had made one terrible mistake. Richard shook his head violently. "You know nothing." Jane's voice remained gentle. "The mistake wasn't yours." He froze. "It was your father's." No one moved. Jane continued quietly. "Your father caused the incident at the quarry all those years ago. Eleanor believed exposing him would destroy your family. When Arthur discovered the truth, he refused to remain silent. Before he could go to the police, he disappeared." Richard closed his eyes. "My father begged them." Jane nodded. "They believed they were protecting an innocent child. My father was dying. They pitied him." Inspector Harcourt spoke. "But someone kept the deception alive long after your father died." Richard slowly lowered his head. "I couldn't let everything come out. You attacked Dr. Bennett." Richard said nothing. "You stole the playing cards." Still silence. "You broke into the station." Finally, Richard looked up. They were getting too close. His voice had become almost calm. "I only wanted the past to stay buried." "And Arthur?" Harcourt asked quietly. Richard swallowed. "I found him before he reached the police." The words hung in the air. He threatened to expose everything. "I lost my temper. I pushed him. It wasn't planned." He struck his head. No one interrupted. "I panicked. My father told me what to do. We made everyone believe Arthur had simply disappeared." Richard's shoulders slumped. When Eleanor received another letter recently, he looked toward the unopened window. "I knew someone else had discovered the truth. So you attacked Dr. Bennett. I hoped he'd remain silent. And when he survived..." Richard closed his eyes. "I finished what I'd started." Clara covered her mouth. Mrs. Dobson quietly sat down, unable to remain standing. Colonel Haversham stared into the fire, his expression filled with sorrow. Philip Grayson removed his spectacles and wiped them slowly. "I should have spoken years ago," he said. "So should all of us." Jane looked at him gently. "Regret cannot change yesterday." "No, but truth may still honor those who deserved it." Inspector Harcourt stepped toward Richard. "Richard Ashcombe." Richard did not resist. "I am arresting you for the murders of Arthur Pembroke and Dr. Harold Bennett, and for the assault committed at Mill Bridge, together with related offenses connected to this investigation." Richard nodded once. "Understand." Sergeant Collins quietly placed him in handcuffs. As they led him from the library, Richard stopped beside Eleanor's portrait. Without speaking, he looked at it for several seconds. Then he walked away. Several weeks later, St. Aldwyn slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The newspapers carried the story for only a few days before turning their attention elsewhere. Arthur Pembroke's remains were finally located after Richard directed investigators to a forgotten section of woodland near the old quarry. He was laid to rest in the churchyard under his own name at last. Dr. Harold Bennett was buried beside his late wife, his funeral attended by nearly the entire village. Colonel Haversham publicly acknowledged his silence before retiring from village affairs. Philip Grayson donated Eleanor's papers to the local historical society, ensuring that no part of the truth would ever again be hidden. Clara Finch chose not to sell Ashcombe House. Instead, she restored the library exactly as Eleanor had left it and opened part of the house as a community reading room, believing Eleanor would have approved. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jane Marlowe walked through the churchyard alone. She paused before Arthur Pembroke's new headstone. Fresh flowers rested at its base. No one else was nearby. Inspector Harcourt joined her after a moment. "It's over," he said. Jane looked across the quiet village. "Yes, but it took nearly 30 years. Truth," she replied softly, "is rather like a letter." He glanced at her. "It may be delayed. It may even be hidden. But if enough people refuse to destroy it," she smiled faintly, "it eventually reaches the person who needs to read it." The church bell struck the hour. A cool breeze carried the sound across the rooftops of St. Aldwyn. For the first time in many years, the village no longer carried the weight of an unfinished promise. The last letter had arrived after the funeral. Its message had come too late to save the innocent who had suffered, but not too late to reveal the truth. The end.